Because you have another moment in history too. The mother might refer to everything she still knows about you, but you yourself, you have changed.
Natural vive el auto en una dinámica de sobrevivir.
In a natural drift, there is a person who lives giving rise to a non-competitive dynamic of differential survival that generates diversity through the conservation of adaptation. If in the life of an organism autopoiesis and coherence is not preserved with the environment, then this living organism will die. We can see this in the course of our everyday lives. If we live in the context of relational framework where we suffer, where we don't feel good, where we have pains, when we're not seen, when there is no presence, then we feel that our body and soul are not in harmony. Or if our children go to school for the first time on their own, then we're worried about whether they will develop their relevant inner dynamism and be able to go along in such a way that they can arrive safely at school. So it always depends on the circumstances. I always ask what circumstances have to be maintained to ensure that life can be preserved. The living organism and circumstances change together. That's not working here. The organism and the circumstances change together in congruent form. If there is no congruence, then the organism will die. And if we have different forms of organisms, then exactly the same will happen. The organisms change together with these circumstances. Every organism is part of the other, and therefore they change together. If they are separated, then they are different organisms with their own specific circumstances. Now, under these circumstances, the concept of natural selection is a commentary in which the observer remarks on the non-competitive differential survival that occurs in the history of populations as a result of the natural drift. So there is a diversity and adaptation. And this brings us on to the third systemic law. Whenever a collection of elements begins to be conserved, the space is open for everything else to change around the relations that are conserved. Now, think of your own personal life. What happens to us in the course of time? Think about technologies. Bear in mind that mobile telephones were developed at some stage in time, and as a result of that, our entire lives have changed. And things have developed to such an extent now that we cannot now conceive of a life without a mobile telephone. Or what do you think? 30 years ago, we were able to get along without mobile telephones, but it was obviously necessary that these mobile telephones should have developed. At least this is what we say after the event, of course. At the moment, the computer system is necessary to ventilate the room. That is no longer the case, but the air changed when the computers came to be used. Now, this systemic law takes place everywhere in the cosmos. We're talking about a culture of change. In Chile, how shall I put it? We have sketches, or let's say we have a number of politicians. I don't want to talk here about politics, but there are some people who come up with these buzzwords and they say things are going to change all the time. But if you hear you've got to change all the time, then you're worried because you don't know what changes are going to actually take place, who are going to be. Organizations have to change all the time, families have to change, therefore the question arises what it is that we want to preserve. And And if we lay down what we want to preserve, then everything changes that is supposed to be changed automatically. We don't have to intervene ourselves. It takes place in our preserving what it is that is to be preserved. What describes the manner of living of an organism are the preferences, habits and fears that the organism has, the emotions it experiences in the course of its everyday life. So an organism is determined by daily emotions, what we wish to have, what we prefer, and so on and so forth. Every rational argument rests on general premises that are accepted a priori, because we're talking about emotions, preferences, everything. And I can put my head on the block if you like. That certainly is true. It's interesting. It really is the case. Yes, that's the way it is, and it's no problem after all, because it doesn't mean that we're not rational. We use our rationale or our reason for other things, not to decide what it is that we do in order to justify that we have taken certain decisions and not taken others. And these are always determined by our emotions. When in a group of organisms a particular manner of living begins to be conserved from one generation to the next, so that in the natural drift of those organisms everything changes around a conservation of that manner of living. Now, this species arrives when a certain type of species pass on from one generation to the next by means of genetic reproduction or by means of a learning process. This is the way in which the generation lives that it passes on. Now, I form part of a species or group of people that responds to Maturana when the name is mentioned. That's a cultural genre that I belong to. And it's something that is learned by children. This is passed on from one generation to the next, and therefore taken on by the children. How many species are there? How many genera are there? There are family life, competition, war, the rejection of certain ways of living, so different types of different modes of life that are passed on from one generation to the next by means of the things that children learn. Now, how are emotions shaped by people who preserve themselves as human beings? And here we come on to the next statement. If we are as we are, then this means that we belong to a type that has been preserved. In other words, that's the reason why we are as we are. And we are organisms that exist through language. As human beings, we are people because we exist in a context of language. And how do we manage that? Well, we are kind to each other. This has to do with birth and a trust that we are loved from the moment of our birth, and we rely on this having something to do with the structure. The butterfly, which comes into the world, is constructed in such a way that it can adapt to the world of flowers and can suck the nectar. And the butterfly has this trust, and that's the way we're produced as well. This is an implicit trust that we have in the organization, the anatomy, the structure, just like the butterfly trust in the fact that it will find nectar and flowers and not insecticides.